Some people believe memory lives inside the mind, but the deepest truths are never stored there. They live inside the heart, waiting for one familiar touch to awaken them. The private recovery wing of St. Gabriel Medical Center had never been so silent. Nurses moved carefully across polished floors, doctors exchanged quiet words outside glass doors, and armed security officers stood watch with expressions that revealed nothing. Behind one of those doors lay Ethan Kong, the Korean Mafia boss whose name carried enough influence to change the course of an entire city with a single phone call. 24 hours earlier, his black SUV had spun across rain-soaked pavement before colliding with a concrete barrier during a violent thunderstorm. The emergency team had worked through the night, and against every expectation, he survived. But survival had come with a cost no surgeon could repair. When Ethan finally opened his eyes beneath the soft glow of fluorescent lights, confusion settled over his face instead of relief. A physician smiled gently and introduced herself. No recognition. His longtime attorney stepped closer, carefully explaining where he was. Nothing. His chief of security removed his sunglasses, hoping a familiar face might trigger a response. Ethan stared back with polite uncertainty, as though he were meeting strangers at a crowded airport. One by one they tried. His closest advisors. His personal physician. Men who had protected him for years. Women who had worked beside him for nearly a decade. Every introduction dissolved into the same empty silence. He remembered his own name, the English language, and fragments of ordinary life. Yet every important person had vanished from his memory, as if someone had quietly erased entire chapters from the story of his life. Outside the room, worried voices filled the hallway. Specialists discussed trauma. Lawyers whispered about succession. Powerful allies exchanged uneasy glances. An empire built over years suddenly depended on a man who no longer recognized the people sworn to stand beside him. Then the hospital room became strangely still. A young woman wearing a simple navy housekeeping uniform stepped hesitantly through the doorway, carrying a fresh bouquet that someone had forgotten in the lobby. Her name was Grace Carter, one of the newest maids at Ethan's estate. She had not been summoned by doctors or executives. She intended only to leave the flowers and quietly disappear before anyone noticed she had entered. She kept her eyes lowered, respecting boundaries she had learned from her first day at the mansion. Before she could turn away, Ethan slowly lifted his head. His gaze settled on her with startling clarity. For the first time since awakening, uncertainty faded from his expression. His breathing steadied. The tightness in his shoulders softened. Without speaking to anyone else in the room, he reached toward Grace with a trembling hand. She instinctively stepped closer, unsure whether she was making a terrible mistake. The instant her fingers rested inside his, the heart monitor settled into a calm, steady rhythm. Ethan closed his eyes for only a second before looking back at her with quiet relief, as though he had finally found the only thing in the world that still made sense. His voice was barely above a whisper, fragile in a way no one present had ever imagined possible. Please, don't let go. Around them, the room fell completely silent because the most powerful man in the city had forgotten everyone except the Black Maid who had somehow become the last memory his heart refused to surrender. 6 months earlier, Grace Carter stepped through the wrought iron gates of the Kong estate with one weathered suitcase, a folded employment letter, and exactly $43 left in her checking account. The mansion rose above the hillside like something carved from polished stone and quiet authority, its towering windows reflecting the morning sun, while perfectly trimmed hedges stretched across nearly 10 acres. It was the kind of place people admired from a distance, but rarely entered. Grace paused for only a moment before taking a slow breath and walking toward the front entrance. This job was not simply another opportunity. It was the difference between rebuilding her life and losing the small apartment where her elderly aunt depended on her support every month. Sophia Bennett, the head housekeeper, greeted her with calm professionalism that carried years of experience. She handed Grace a neatly pressed uniform before leading her through endless marble hallways that seemed more like an art museum than a family home. Every painting hung with exact precision. Every chandelier reflected perfectly polished floors. Every clock ticked with quiet discipline. Nothing appeared out of place, and neither, Sophia explained, should any employee. Before Grace touched her first cleaning card, she was given 3 rules that everyone repeated without hesitation. Never enter the private East Wing unless instructed. Never interrupt a meeting, no matter what you hear. And never attempt a conversation with Mr. Ethan Kong unless he speaks first. Grace nodded without asking questions. She had worked long enough to understand that every wealthy household carried invisible boundaries. Some were written. Others existed only in silence. Throughout her first week, she noticed that the staff rarely mentioned Ethan by name. They referred to him simply as Mr. Kong. Gardeners lowered their voices whenever his car entered the driveway. Chefs checked every plate twice before serving dinner. Security officers stood a little straighter whenever his footsteps echoed across the foyer. Yet despite his reputation, Grace almost never saw him. He left before sunrise. He returned after dark. His presence was felt more than witnessed, like distant thunder rolling across an empty valley. On the 8th morning, while polishing the grand staircase railing, Grace finally caught sight of him. He descended from the second floor wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair neatly combed, his expression unreadable. Conversations around the foyer disappeared instantly. Employees stepped aside without being asked. Ethan acknowledged no one, not because he was cruel, but because his mind never seemed to leave whatever burden rested upon his shoulders. He walked past Grace without slowing, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. She lowered her eyes exactly as she had been instructed. A faint breeze followed him as the front doors opened and closed behind his security team. Only after the vehicles disappeared beyond the gates did the house begin breathing again. During lunch, one of the senior maids quietly smiled at Grace across the staff dining room. "Do not take it personally," she whispered. "Most people spend years here without hearing him say more than good morning." Grace simply smiled back. She had not come searching for recognition. She had come searching for stability, honest work, and the chance to build a future one quiet day at a time. She could not possibly know that the silent man everyone feared would one day remember nothing in the world except the comfort of her hand. Days turned quietly into weeks, and Grace discovered that the Kong estate was held together not only by wealth, but by dozens of ordinary people whose names would never appear in newspapers. Every morning before sunrise, the kitchen staff prepared breakfast with practiced precision. Gardeners trimmed hedges that stretched for hundreds of feet. Drivers inspected luxury vehicles until every surface reflected the morning light. Grace learned each routine quickly, always arriving a few minutes early and leaving only after every assignment was complete. She never sought attention, yet kindness seemed to follow her naturally. When Mr. Alvarez, the 70-year-old groundskeeper, struggled to lift heavy bags of mulch because arthritis had stiffened his hands, Grace quietly helped him before beginning her own duties. She never mentioned it to anyone. When one of the young kitchen assistants accidentally burned a tray of fresh pastries and feared losing his job, Grace stayed after her shift to help him prepare another batch before the breakfast service began. Again, she asked for no credit. Even the aging golden retriever that wandered the property every afternoon eventually chose to nap beside her cleaning cart, patiently waiting until she finished polishing the sunroom windows before following her across the gardens. The other employees noticed these small moments. They smiled whenever Grace entered the staff dining room because somehow the atmosphere felt lighter around her. Sophia noticed it as well but said nothing, believing that genuine character never needed applause. Unknown to everyone inside the mansion, another pair of eyes occasionally witnessed these quiet acts from a distance. Ethan rarely lingered at home, yet whenever business meetings ended earlier than expected, he sometimes crossed the property alone before returning to his office. One rainy afternoon, he paused beneath the covered terrace after noticing Grace kneeling beside the old dog, carefully drying its soaked fur with a clean towel while speaking in the same gentle voice she used with frightened children. She did not know he was there. She simply smiled at the tired animal and whispered that every living soul deserved warmth after a storm. Ethan remained silent for several seconds before walking away without announcing himself. Another evening, he noticed Grace carrying 2 dinner trays instead of 1. Curious, he watched through the dining room window as she quietly placed the second meal beside Mr. Alvarez, pretending it had been prepared by the kitchen so the proud old groundskeeper would never feel embarrassed accepting help. Ethan continued walking without interrupting them, but for reasons he could not explain, that simple image stayed with him longer than the financial reports waiting on his desk. Days later, he entered the library unexpectedly while Grace was dusting shelves lined with rare first editions. She stepped aside immediately, lowering her eyes just as the rules required. Ethan reached for a book, hesitated, then noticed she had already arranged every volume in perfect order according to the catalog system that even experienced staff occasionally confused. He gave a nearly invisible nod before leaving the room. It was only a brief gesture, so subtle that Grace wondered if she had imagined it. Yet after he disappeared into the hallway, she realized something unusual had happened. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Mr. Kong had truly looked at her, not as another uniform passing through endless hallways, but as a person whose quiet presence had begun leaving traces that neither of them fully understood. Late October arrived with cold rain drifting across the city, turning every road into a mirror beneath gray skies. The staff at the Kong estate had grown accustomed to Ethan's unpredictable schedule, but one Thursday evening carried an unusual sense of urgency. Business calls stretched later than expected. Security vehicles lined the circular driveway with engines already running while assistants hurried between offices carrying folders that required immediate signatures. Grace watched quietly from the front hallway as the household settled into its familiar rhythm of controlled efficiency. She finished arranging fresh white lilies in the entrance foyer just as Ethan descended the staircase, fastening the final button on his dark overcoat. Their eyes met for only a brief second before he continued toward the waiting vehicles. Without thinking, Grace noticed that he looked unusually tired. The confidence remained, but exhaustion rested behind his eyes like someone who had not truly slept in weeks. She almost wished him a safe evening, yet the rules returned before the words could leave her lips. The convoy disappeared through the front gates moments before heavy rain began falling with surprising force. By nightfall, distant thunder rolled across the skyline, while wind pressed against the mansion windows. Inside, employees quietly finished their duties, expecting another ordinary evening. Then, shortly after 8 o'clock, every phone inside the estate rang almost at once. Conversations stopped instantly. Sophia answered the nearest call, and the color slowly drained from her face. Mr. Kang's vehicle had been involved in a serious traffic accident nearly 20 miles from the estate. He had been transported to St. Gabriel Medical Center, and no one yet knew the extent of his condition. The mansion fell into stunned silence. Some employees whispered prayers. Others stood frozen, uncertain what to do next. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken before she reached for her coat, without fully understanding why. Sophia gently reminded everyone that only family members and senior executives were expected at the hospital. Grace nodded respectfully, yet something deep inside refused to let her remain behind. 30 minutes later, she quietly arrived at the emergency entrance after paying for a rideshare with nearly the last money she had planned to save for groceries that week. The waiting area overflowed with worried faces dressed in tailored suits, expensive coats, and polished shoes. Grace stayed near the back, hoping no one would question why a maid had come. Through the glass doors, she caught a distant glimpse of doctors moving quickly through brightly lit hallways, while nurses prepared equipment with calm precision. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. One executive after another left to answer urgent calls, but Grace remained seated beneath the soft glow of the waiting room lights, quietly praying that the man who barely knew her name would survive another sunrise. Just before dawn, a nurse stepped into the hallway carrying a small bag containing Ethan's personal belongings. As she hurried toward another department, a silver cuff link slipped unnoticed onto the polished floor. Grace picked it up carefully. It was engraved with a single letter, the same letter stitched inside every tailored jacket Ethan owned. Without hesitation, she handed it back to the grateful nurse, who smiled warmly before disappearing again. Moments later, another physician emerged with encouraging news. Ethan had made it through surgery, but he remained unconscious. Family members would have to wait before visiting. Everyone slowly exhaled with relief. Grace quietly turned toward the chapel, folded her hands, and whispered one simple prayer. At that exact moment, behind closed intensive care doors, Ethan's unconscious fingers moved almost imperceptibly, as though searching through darkness for the familiar hand that had stayed closer than anyone realized. Morning sunlight slowly filtered through the hospital windows, painting soft golden lines across polished floors that had not slept through the night. Outside Ethan's room, physicians continued reviewing test results while attorneys answered urgent calls from business partners who demanded updates. Inside, however, none of those conversations seemed to matter. Ethan remained awake, alert, and physically stable, yet every familiar face produced the same distant expression of polite confusion. His chief of security introduced himself again. Ethan apologized quietly and admitted he could not remember him. The family attorney carefully showed photographs taken over many years, pointing to celebrations, business meetings, and charitable events. Ethan studied every image with sincere concentration, but they felt like someone else's memories. Even the grand estate where he had lived for years seemed completely unfamiliar when doctors described it. The specialists agreed that his long-term memory had been affected in an unusually selective way, but no one could explain why certain emotional responses remained untouched. Throughout the morning, medical staff noticed one strange pattern. Whenever too many visitors entered the room, Ethan became visibly overwhelmed. His pulse climbed. His breathing grew uneven. The doctors politely asked everyone to step outside so he could rest. As the hallway gradually emptied, Grace quietly prepared to leave as well. She had no reason to remain. She was only a maid, and the estate would soon need every employee back at work. She turned toward the elevator, believing no one had even noticed she was there, when a nurse hurried after her with an unexpected request. One of the physicians had remembered seeing her sitting in the waiting area through the entire night. They wondered whether Ethan might respond differently to a calm, unfamiliar presence instead of another round of formal introductions. Grace hesitated, uncertain whether such a request was appropriate, but finally agreed. She stepped carefully into the room, keeping a respectful distance near the doorway. Ethan looked up almost immediately. The tension that had clouded his face since sunrise seemed to soften without effort. His eyes followed her as though recognizing something comforting beyond words. Grace offered a gentle smile and quietly wished him good morning. She did not ask whether he remembered her. She simply introduced herself by name, just as she would introduce herself to any stranger. Ethan repeated her name slowly, almost testing how it felt. Grace. The single word carried a quiet certainty that surprised everyone present. He gestured toward the chair beside his bed, silently asking her to stay. Grace sat down cautiously, folding her hands in her lap. They spoke about simple things instead of lost memories. The weather outside, the view from the window, the fresh flowers someone had placed near the bed. For the first time since waking, Ethan smiled naturally. Nurses exchanged puzzled glances after noticing that every vital sign on the monitor had settled into remarkably steady patterns. One doctor quietly documented the change, careful not to interrupt the moment. Grace eventually stood, believing she had already stayed too long. But before she could take a single step away, Ethan reached out once more and gently held her hand. His voice remained soft, carrying neither authority nor command, only quiet honesty. I do not know why, he admitted, looking directly into her eyes. But when you are here, everything feels less frightening. Grace could not explain it either. She simply offered a reassuring smile while the room filled with a silence that no medical chart, scientific theory, or lifetime of experience could fully understand. By the third day, word had quietly spread through every floor of St. Gabriel Medical Center that something unusual was happening inside Ethan Kang's recovery room. The medical team continued their evaluations with remarkable professionalism, yet every specialist arrived at the same conclusion. His physical recovery was progressing steadily, but his emotional responses followed no pattern that modern medicine could explain. Familiar faces brought uncertainty. Business discussions created visible fatigue. Endless introductions only deepened his frustration. Yet the moment Grace Carter entered the room, a quiet sense of calm returned as naturally as sunlight breaking through morning clouds. Outside the room, however, that calm did not exist. Senior executives gathered around conference tables reviewing urgent financial reports while members of Ethan's inner circle debated every decision that needed his approval. The longer his memory remained incomplete, the more unstable the future of his organization appeared. Some believed Grace's presence was helping his recovery. Others viewed it as an unacceptable complication. One executive finally voiced what several people had been whispering for hours. She is a housekeeper. This situation has gone too far. Another nodded in agreement, insisting that professional therapists should replace her immediately. Their conversations never reached Grace directly, but she sensed the tension each time she walked through the hallway. She kept her head lowered and focused only on following every instruction given by the nurses. She never asked for special access. She never accepted attention. She simply appeared whenever Ethan requested to see her and quietly returned home when visiting hours ended. One afternoon, Dr. Rebecca Lawson decided to conduct a simple observation. She politely asked Grace to remain outside the room for 30 minutes while the medical team completed another round of memory exercises. During that half hour, Ethan answered every question with patience, but his growing restlessness became impossible to ignore. He repeatedly glanced toward the closed door without realizing he was doing it. His concentration drifted. Even the crossword puzzle that had briefly held his interest remained unfinished. Finally, he looked at the doctor with sincere confusion. "Is the woman named Grace coming back today?" The physician smiled gently and asked why he wanted to see her. Ethan considered the question carefully before answering. "Because when she talks, I stop feeling lost." Those few words changed the atmosphere more than any medical report could have. Dr. Lawson quietly invited Grace back into the room. The difference appeared almost immediately. Ethan relaxed into his chair and asked Grace to tell him about the estate where he lived. She described the gardens blooming in spring, the old golden retriever sleeping beside the greenhouse, the library filled with books from every corner of the world, and the elderly groundskeeper who proudly grew tomatoes every summer. Ethan listened with genuine curiosity, almost as though she were describing a place he hoped to visit someday, instead of the home he had built himself. As she spoke, tiny fragments stirred beneath the surface of his mind. Not complete memories, only brief feelings. The scent of fresh cedar after rain. The sound of footsteps echoing across marble floors. A warm afternoon filled with sunlight filtering through tall windows. He could not explain why those images appeared, but each one arrived only while Grace's voice filled the room. Standing quietly behind the observation window, the doctors exchanged thoughtful glances. They still had no scientific explanation for what they were witnessing, but one truth had become impossible to deny. Sometimes the strongest path back to memory did not begin with facts or photographs. Sometimes it began with the quiet presence of someone whose kindness had reached a place deeper than memory itself. 1 week after Ethan regained consciousness, the hospital no longer felt like a temporary stop between tragedy and recovery. It had quietly become the center of an unfolding mystery. Every morning brought another small breakthrough, yet none of them followed the path the doctors expected. Ethan still struggled to recognize the people who had managed his business for years, but he could now describe the fragrance of the white lilies that decorated the entrance hall of his estate, because Grace had mentioned replacing them every Monday. He remembered the old golden retriever stretching beneath the greenhouse windows before he remembered the address of his own home. Dr. Rebecca Lawson found the pattern remarkable. His mind seemed to be rebuilding itself through emotions before facts, through moments of comfort instead of titles or accomplishments. While Ethan focused on healing, others focused on protecting their own interests. Several executives privately questioned whether Grace should continue visiting every day. They insisted that the unusual attachment was slowing his return to normal decision-making. Sophia Bennett listened quietly before responding with calm confidence. She has never asked for anything. She simply shows up when he needs someone to remind him that he is safe. No one could argue with that. Grace herself remained completely unaware of the conversations taking place. Behind closed conference room doors, she continued living exactly as she always had, arriving at the hospital after finishing her morning responsibilities at the estate and leaving before sunset so the evening staff could take over. She never accepted gifts, interviews, or praise. To her, Ethan was simply another human being trying to find his way through fear and uncertainty. One quiet afternoon, Ethan asked if Grace would bring him a notebook from the hospital gift shop. When she returned, he opened to the first blank page and wrote only one sentence in careful handwriting. "Things that feel true." Grace looked at him with gentle curiosity as he explained that facts kept slipping away, but feelings remained. Together, they began filling the notebook with simple memories she described from everyday life. The library smelled like cedar after rain. Morning sunlight reached the breakfast room at exactly 8 o'clock during the spring. Mr. Alvarez always harvested the first tomatoes before anyone else noticed they were ripe. The old dog preferred sleeping beside the greenhouse because the glass stayed warm in the afternoon. Ethan listened to every detail before writing it down, not because he remembered those moments, but because each one felt strangely familiar inside his heart. As the pages slowly filled, another unexpected change appeared. Ethan began asking questions that had nothing to do with business or wealth. He wanted to know why Grace had chosen housekeeping, what inspired her to help others without expecting recognition, and what she dreamed about when no one else was watching. Grace answered honestly. She spoke about caring for her elderly aunt, believing that dignity could be found in honest work, and discovering that kindness often mattered most when nobody was paying attention. Ethan remained silent for several moments after hearing her words. Then he smiled with quiet admiration. "Maybe that is why your voice feels familiar," he said softly. "Perhaps my mind forgot the past, but my heart remembered the person who made me feel at peace." Standing outside the room, Dr. Lawson closed Ethan's medical chart and looked through the window with thoughtful eyes because she realized they were witnessing something far greater than the slow return of memory. They were watching trust become the bridge that carried one lost soul back toward himself, one quiet conversation at a time. Nearly 2 weeks after the accident, Ethan was finally strong enough to leave the hospital for short supervised visits outside. Dr. Rebecca Lawson believed that familiar places might awaken additional memories, so she arranged a carefully planned afternoon at the estate. The long driveway appeared exactly as Grace had described countless times, bordered by towering oak trees whose autumn leaves drifted gently across the pavement. As the vehicle approached the mansion, Ethan watched every detail through the window with quiet anticipation, hoping that something, anything, would feel unmistakably his. Employees gathered respectfully near the entrance to welcome him home, their smiles warm but restrained. Ethan greeted each person with sincere kindness, apologizing whenever he failed to recognize a familiar face. No one blamed him. They simply wished for his continued recovery. Grace remained several steps behind the others, believing the moment belonged to the people who had known him far longer than she had. Yet as soon as Ethan stepped onto the front porch, his eyes searched the crowd until they found her. Only then did the uncertainty leave his expression. He smiled gently, and everyone noticed. Throughout the afternoon, Dr. Lawson encouraged Ethan to explore different rooms at his own pace. He walked through the grand library, tracing polished bookshelves with his fingertips. He stood beside the fireplace where countless meetings had once taken place. He paused in the dining room as sunlight streamed through tall windows exactly as Grace had described in the hospital. Small impressions surfaced one after another. The scent of cedar, the soft echo of footsteps across marble, the distant melody of a grandfather clock marking another passing hour. None of these moments returned as complete memories, but together they formed a bridge leading somewhere just beyond his reach. Then Grace quietly suggested visiting the greenhouse before sunset. Ethan agreed without hesitation. The glass walls glowed with warm afternoon light, surrounding them with rows of carefully tended flowers and herbs. In one corner, the elderly golden retriever slowly lifted its head before walking directly toward Ethan. The old dog wagged its tail once, then rested peacefully beside his feet as though greeting an old friend. Ethan knelt instinctively, gently stroking the dog's soft fur. The simple touch stirred something unexpectedly powerful. A faint image crossed his mind. Rain tapping against glass. Grace laughing softly while drying the dog's wet coat with a towel. The feeling disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Yet this time Ethan did not let it slip away. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. More fragments followed. Grace carrying dinner to Mr. Alvarez. Grace arranging fresh lilies in the foyer. Grace quietly straightening books in the library while afternoon sunlight filled the room. They were not dramatic memories. They were ordinary moments he had never consciously valued, yet somehow they had survived where everything else had faded. Ethan opened his eyes and looked at Grace with growing wonder. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "My mind remembered power. My heart remembered peace." Grace smiled but said nothing. She simply looked around the greenhouse, allowing the silence to speak for both of them. From the doorway, Dr. Lawson watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction because she realized the missing pieces were no longer returning through pressure or effort. They were returning through gratitude, one gentle memory at a time, carried back by the quiet presence of the woman who had never once asked to be remembered. Winter arrived quietly, and with it came the final pieces of a journey that no one inside the Kong estate could have imagined only a few weeks earlier. Ethan's strength returned day by day, and so did much of his memory. He once again recognized the executives who had worked beside him for years, remembered the names of trusted employees, and resumed making careful decisions that restored confidence throughout his organization. Yet those who knew him best noticed something even more remarkable than the memories he had recovered. The distance that had once surrounded him had quietly disappeared. He no longer walked through the mansion without acknowledging the people who cared for it. Every morning, he greeted the kitchen staff before breakfast. He thanked the gardeners for keeping the grounds beautiful through every season. He stopped to ask Mr. Alvarez how the winter vegetables were growing inside the greenhouse. The estate had not become less disciplined, but it had become warmer. One crisp Saturday morning, Ethan asked Sophia Bennett to invite every employee to the main courtyard after lunch. The request surprised everyone. Gatherings of the entire household were rare, and no one knew what to expect. Grace arrived wearing the same simple navy uniform she had worn since her first day, believing she would quietly stand near the back as always. Instead, Ethan stepped forward carrying a small wooden box polished to a soft shine. He looked across the familiar faces surrounding him before his eyes rested on Grace. "There was a time," he began calmly, "when I believed success was measured by influence, wealth, and control. Then one unexpected moment taught me that the strongest person in any room may be the one who asks for nothing and still chooses kindness." The courtyard became completely silent. Ethan opened the box and removed an old brass key attached to a leather keychain that had clearly been treasured for many years. He explained that it belonged to the first home his late mother had purchased after arriving in America, a place she always described as the foundation of their family's future. Recently restored, the small house had become a symbol of gratitude rather than inheritance. Ethan gently placed the key into Grace's hands. "This is not payment," he said with quiet sincerity. "No gift could ever repay what you gave me. This is simply a reminder that my family will always have a place for the person who helped me find my way home." Tears filled several eyes throughout the courtyard, but Grace remained still, holding the key with both hands as though it carried far more meaning than metal ever could. She thanked him softly before answering with the same humility that had defined every quiet act throughout the past months. "I only stayed because no one should have to face fear alone." Ethan smiled, and for the first time since the accident, a complete memory returned with perfect clarity. He remembered waking in the darkness of uncertainty, feeling one steady hand refusing to let go until hope returned. He realized that while his mind had struggled to rebuild the past, his heart had recognized the truth from the very beginning. As the afternoon sun settled across the estate, the old golden retriever wandered peacefully through the courtyard before resting beside Grace once again. No one hurried to break the silence, because some moments deserved to last exactly as they were. And on that quiet winter afternoon, everyone present remembered that the greatest legacy any person can leave behind is not power, but the simple courage to offer kindness when it is needed most.